If you want to make a decision, anybody in the company can make any decision as long as, number one, they talk to everybody who knows more about the topic than they do. Secondly, they talk to everybody who's affected by the decision, and then they make the decision.
Hi, I am Sophie Vaux, and this is the Rise and Play podcast. In the show, I sit down with influential thought leaders in the gaming industry to deconstruct how they create the best teams and company cultures in order to create the best games. Speaking to hundreds of game executives in the show, I have identified recurring patterns and mistakes that we all make in our leadership journey. Do you have to go through the same hurdles and make the same mistakes to learn too? You are not alone in this journey, and hopefully, you can learn from a diverse range of seasoned leaders who already walked the talk. Every episode brings actionable insights and case studies that will help you improve your management skills, self-awareness, and empathic communication. Becoming a better leader starts with becoming a better human. Are you ready to unlock your full potential in life and business? Let's begin. So welcome everyone. Here we are on a new episode of Rise and Play, and I'm sitting here in Helsinki at the studio of Lightheart Entertainment with Kalle Koivula, that also I've known for 4 years. And in this series, I am continuing as well to interview co-founders of startups and also with an interesting approach, different approach on company culture. And here we are reflecting 4 years after the foundation of the company, 4 years ago when we discussed, and also interesting time to reflect as well on the specific company culture that you've implemented since the early days. So you have 25 years in the industry, like in media, entertainment, games, a bit all around, like also founding also other ventures, I think, as well in the past.
Capital, yeah.
Yes. Today, you are one of the founders of Lightheart Entertainment. Started 4 years ago in Helsinki here, where I am, for a time of PGC Helsinki as well. Your studio has been known for the hit, I can say a hit, because it's really hard these days releasing new games that are growing and also make a company live. Mr. Autofire, which has counted to date 16 million of download. And the genre of the game is a platformer shooter. I have played it as well, like very cute, like with that Mr. Autofire we see here. And that's the game, like the main game you have had so far with, of course, development of new games. What we are here today to talk about, company culture, and really caught my attention at the time. You were creating the company not to make good games only, but also finding better ways to make games. And where we have found common discussion was at the time, we have had interest in the same book, Reinventing Organization from Frédéric Laloux, that I recommend. And you wanted to build a studio that doesn't have a traditional hierarchy and something different, which we will cover today. So with no further ado, welcome Kalle to your own office, but welcome on the podcast. So pleased to have you today.
Great to have you on the podcast over here. And I think it's funny, we spoke 4 years ago. It feels like a lifetime ago because we had just set up the company. We had COVID was yet to happen, like all the madness that has happened in the mobile industry was still to happen. But yeah, we started the studio after Frédéric Laloux's book had already come out. We as founders read it and had these notions of, hey, if we're going to start a new company in Helsinki in 2019, we should have some kind of a better idea than to just make new games, because there's a lot of studios in town. So that was one of the driving forces. And that's when one of our founders was like, so what if we don't have managers? And I was like, I got to tell you, like my immediate knee jerk was like, what, we don't have managers? Like, that's my entire self-worth as like my whole marketability as a professional is built on my like managerial and director level experience. Are you crazy? You're gonna, ruin this for me. And then I was fortunately I shut up at the moment. I was like, why do I have such a strong like feeling about it? Why does this invoke so much dread in me, the idea that there are no managers? What are these fears? Like, I better get to the bottom of these before I say something really stupid. And I explored that thought. And yeah, I mean, it took me on personally on a journey of kind of figuring out like that, in fact, any sort of managerial position I'd ever held, I'd always taken kind of the role to be that, like, I want to enable the people who are in my team or in the group that I'm in to succeed, to enable them to do better. And often I would actually create a very non-hierarchical bubble within a very hierarchical organization, which is problematic sometimes because you have to interface with the rest of the company and so on. This was like, I realized once I got the shock out of the system, like this would be an opportunity to try to do that for real, like for mandated. So I'm supposed to do that. That felt like a good challenge. That felt something new, terrifying, but in kind of good, terrifying way.
I like traveling back like 4 years ago when we've had that conversation and in the context that it was. And I want to reflect on a few things that you just shared. Like you have had a lot of experience in gaming, and I think again, like you felt in your heart that there was maybe another way to build teams that was true to you. And what I appreciate is like when you were really in the position to create something new, you could have decided to follow what's proven. And also, I think like deconstructing even, I would say, which I found difficult, not only in games, but when we look at position of power, leadership, founders, the ego, because what you're talking about is like, who am I if I'm not a manager and I don't have the title and the power? And you said, okay, I need to figure this out inside before I even start a company. Do you remember some of that process that was introspection for you to be okay with that thought, like with the fears that you had before starting a company like this, where you're letting go of control?
Yeah, we actually have a magnet on the fridge of the company that says "relax, nothing is under control," which I feel is sort of exemplifies the kind of thinking there, like because it also implies that weirdly everything is under control. But I think it's a longer route to get there. We'll be talking about it, but I think ego is exactly right. I think that's what you need to look at because I noticed myself going through kind of that mental process that what if what I say doesn't automatically go? What if I'm not the boss of the company and I'm like, because I'm like, for the context of this, I'm the CEO of the company, but it looks very different from a traditional role. Like I don't go around managing people. It looks very different. But at the end of the day, I started, so what I started thinking about was like, looking at all the sort of the strongest leaders I work with, and then the sort of the least efficient leaders, and the more you kind of relied on the fact that what I say goes, the less effective you were typically as a leader. It's just, you start seeing enough of that pattern emerge and you realize that I'm like, it doesn't matter whether I'm in sort of indirect charge of these things. In order for me to be efficient as a leader, I still need to make the case for these things. I still need to operate with things like, like setting goals in an understandable fashion and kind of forming the idea of getting somewhere. And, that's never going to be a thing where if I just come here and I'm yelling to do this or that thing, that's not very impactful in terms of getting anywhere. I mean, not to even mention that, a game company typically has a lot of passionate experts who are really good at what they do. And if somebody tries to micromanagement, they immediately become the bottleneck of the whole organization. Yeah. And the organization cannot rise above the deficits of that individual. And I have many deficits. I don't want to be that guy. I'm very cognizant of sort of limits of my abilities there. So I'd much rather approach it from this angle. It has been a lot better for me now that I can do it openly and I don't have to sort of fear an external party looking into, what are you doing? You don't have, well, this guy isn't reporting to you. I don't have to worry about what an outside organization thinks about us.
Yeah, I think when you are creating your own company, the thing you can do the most for yourself is one that really looks like what you and what you believe in, like when you really look inwards and not what you think is expected of you. As when we have more roles in the organization, we fit a role and what is expected of us. It's not always what we want to do, but here you have a full opportunity to actually try something that looks like you as a group of co-founders, your theory and your beliefs.
Exactly. And I think what we are trying to do is like, how do we, like our challenge is, how do we scale this? Like as a group of founders, I think initially, I was speaking with one of my co-founders, Mika Ahonen, the other day, and like, we were talking about our kind of early days. And I think like he had a good point that, that when you think about the best teams and, that you've been in, what do they have in common? Very often they weirdly have this kind of, they have similar things in them. Like when you think about like, when was the last time you were making games and you were really excited in the morning to get up and do your thing and, be part of the team? Typically those teams actually aren't like these hierarchically run things where there's a director, like everybody kind of knows what to do. They know their roles and they've kind of in a very fine-tuned fashion, define their roles within the team, not in a sort of here's the list of our job titles and corresponding responsibilities, and here's our Roski charts determining our responsibilities, etc. Like those don't typically bring the kind of, when you get to this very super efficient kind of phase of interfacing with each other, it requires a lot more fine-tuned conversations, and they're best kind of left to the individuals to do amongst themselves. Like these teams tend to have a self-organizing element to them. And that's kind of what we want to encourage. And to us, it's a tightrope act sometimes of, the teams we have should also look a little different from each other, because no two groups of individuals form in exactly the same kind of ways, because people are different. And we have a lot of very multidisciplined, multi-skilled experts. They, by nature, form around problems in a different way. So we're kind of figuring out what are the best sort of boundaries and constraints that a team could have, or what are the best practices that we could offer available to the teams when they're, developing these ways of forming together.
All right. And as we already got into the topic, let's get indeed in the details. But for context as well of our listeners, what are we talking about? Like the reference of the culture that you had in mind when you started. So back to the book Reinventing Organization, there's a hierarchy of different organizations with the color coding. Like you have orange, green, and then teal. And teal is like the one, if I have a way to describe, like purpose-driven organization, self-organized, as you said the word, and we'll get into detail about that. I'm curious about how, because I think you were several co-founders when you started, 4 or 5?
So we had 5 working co-founders in the beginning.
So this is already, I remember when I read the book, it's a provocative, I felt like it's provocative idea and theory, and I love it. And I was like, how does that work in practice? And so I imagine whoever came up with the thought, one or several people, how do you align 5 people to even start a company based on that? How did that conversation go at the start to let's try this, as a group?
Me sort of being the person who would have traditionally been at the top of hierarchy, I felt like I had to go through some amount of pain to kind of get behind it. And I think, but I think like very quickly, like once I got over the hump of understanding that this actually mirrors what I've inherently tried to do anyway, sort of organically, it was a little easier. But I think, when you start a new company, they tend to have a teal element to them. If you have 5 people in a room working together, it's quite natural for sort of roles and responsibilities to form organically. You build trust, like you typically have a lot of very active transparency, not just, we have all the information in a file in a Dropbox folder somewhere. No, it's like very active that people tell each other what they need as context for what they do. And they're very active in doing that. For us, like, it was really important to kind of take this seriously and not treat this as kind of a shortcut to, we don't have any rules at all. We don't have any hierarchy, so we don't have anything. Like to keep like actively making sure that things are happening, like decisions are being made. If you want to make a decision, anybody in the company can make any decision, as long as, number one, they talk to everybody who knows more about the topic than they do. Notice talk, not ask for permission, talk to everybody. Secondly, they talk to everybody who's affected by the decision. And then they make the decision. That's the process. Of course, like if the decision is something more meaningful than where are we going for lunch, you probably want to document it as well. So I feel this is kind of a little nerdy, techie way of looking at it. I feel this is like, for the programming people out there, I feel this is like a base class of decision making. And then you can have like subclasses that incorporate these elements, but might have more features added on top of that. I think a very good example of that is we very soon realized that hiring needs to be, we can do it with this process, but it has to have for the hiring process to be effective and transparent and sort of and work well for both the company and the applicant. It's important that it's very repeatable and it has the same elements, and you're making decisions informed about that everybody knows who we're talking about and so on. So that process is based on this, but it's a lot more convoluted, but it has a lot more steps, but in the end, it has the same elements. But that's what we really focused on, is how the advice process sort of works. And people tend to make good decisions. People tend to want to make good decisions. They want to make informed decisions. and they want to make fair decisions, especially if you screen in recruitment for people who want to have a more holistic take on their work, make decisions more broadly than just their sort of specialist niche that they're also doing. So I think a lot of the processes that we see in, whether it's like in companies or maybe even if you look at legislation at large, they tend to be, I feel, formed out of fear of abuse. So a lot of the things that we do are built so that what if somebody does this? What if somebody does that? And I feel, the end result of that is such a giant baggage of collective debt that it's kind of it stifles what we can do, because just on the off chance you do something awful, something terrible, that's just rarely the case. Like when we started, I had this kind of weird running clock in my mind, like how many days or weeks or months before we have to, essentially some kind of veto situation needs to happen, like meaning this conflict resolution process hasn't happened yet. 4 years and running. Like I feel that the fact that people have the ability to affect change where they want it, I think that also makes people a little more, interested in engaged in the company in a way, because they have the ability to do more and they're less sort of driven by the political winds of whatever is happening there. And of course, we're at 30 people. The question for us is, can we do this at 300 people? I don't know, but I'm optimistic. I want to try. Like, I feel it's a meaningful thing. It's a good goal for us. It's a good thing to see if we can get there. But, so far I've been surprised at how awesome people are in general and how easily we forget that, weirdly.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing all of it as well. Reflection point of 4 years later, between the theory and the practice. I have also built a studio, and then when you have a philosophy on how to make a team, for me, I have found it helpful to even write it for myself, for whoever comes in, to even verbalize my own thoughts, or how are we working here? How did you convey like those principles for people joining, or did they receive it from others by communication? What are, yeah.
I don't know. I get it. Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because that has a lot of different aspects to it. I think like one of them is kind of, we put a lot of work into hiring, and as when you're in a big organization, you tend to do a bunch of hiring and be involved in that. I think that leads to this weird fallacy of your competence, so that if you ask people on the street, stop them, ask them, are you an above average driver? 90% are going to say that yes. And statistically, of course, that's not going to work. I feel hiring is the same thing in companies. Like people are like, yeah, I'm pretty good at it. And then I started like thinking like, what if I look a little, like just kind of look at it a little bit more sort of openly and honestly. And I realized that I'm not sure I'm very good at it at all. Like we took it very seriously, that we kind of learned hiring in general, and then specifically figured out like, how do we apply what we're trying to do to this? Because it's really important that we find people who want to join us. And we started finding sort of questions on how do we bring that up and started developing kind of a method for that, but like telling about exactly the good and the bad associated with this, so that people who don't like this were able to kind of go, whoa, okay, I didn't realize that would involve all that, so maybe not. And I think it's important, because you alluded to this earlier as well. There's surely downsides to this as well. Like the advice process, it does put a lot of pressure on an individual to kind of be part of the meaningful decision making of the company, whether it's through making a lot of decisions yourself, or enabling others to make decisions, or taking part in the sort of advice process from the sidelines. And that's not trivial, because though the advice process it's pretty robust in the sense that it produces good results, but it can fall victim to a lot of sort of bad faith practices. There are people who are like, just these, if you think about like phenomenon in any kind of human conversation, like social media, you think about sea lioning, where people like incessantly ask irrelevant questions and kind of drain everybody of energy. If you do that to the advice process, it does start to crumble. People start to avoid making decisions. So there needs to be a bit of sort of, I don't want to call it tone policing, because I think tone is not doing justice to the gravity of how important this is, but kind of shielding the process so that it remains a good faith process, like that don't subvert it to your own goals. And some of the things like where we are at right now, 4 years in, some of this is happening organically, but we don't necessarily have a replicatable mold where we can just copy paste like
Yeah.
indefinitely like into teams. We learned 2 years ago when we started our second team, like after Mr. Autofire, we started working on Sword Game. We realized that, wow, like this is one of those things that we knew we'd hit this bump in the road at some point. Whenever an organization splits into two things, where previously you could focus on one thing and everything you could always, prioritize according to the one defining reason, in our case, Mr. Autofire, it was easy to make a lot of decisions, but everything gets a lot more complicated after that. So we kind of got over that hump. Now that we are better at, we have these roles and responsibilities within the teams. They are more, we prefer these kind of best practices rather than strict guidelines that this is how to operate. But we're kind of past that. But what we're not yet is like, how would you roll this out to a giant organization? This is something we're constantly learning. And I think this is crucial from anybody kind of building an organization like this, to remember that you're going to be learning a lot. And going to circle back to the ego comment. Ego can really get in the way of you learning. And I think that's one of the hurdles that all of us as founders have had to go through. I feel the game industry is quite suited for this kind of thinking, because like our industry's moving forward so fast that we have to relearn the market and things anyway. Yeah. So why not process this while we're doing it, and then kind of organizational philosophy as well.
Yeah, and that's why what you're sharing today with game studio practices is kind of a new era of some studios trying different philosophies. Yes. I think this is an essential point when we start to build a culture. It starts with the people that you're hiring. And I want to get to some details of like pure people, because those are interesting and also quite controversial. And I'm really curious how it has worked for you. So there's one which is no titles, right? I don't know if to this point, like when you had the vision, is it still true today where you don't have the titles, but somehow people understand what they're doing, what is expected of each other? From my experience, I have seen as well, hiring fast, sometimes that can lead to some complication where roles are overlapping. Yeah. And second question is related, like how a studio grows is also how people grow, evolve. So there comes like things like perks, training, promotion, and also salary. And I understood as well, like salary are defined as well by the group or individuals. Yes. And I'm very curious how in practice that has worked for you. Has it been the same since the early days? How has it evolved? What are your key learnings around that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things. We've certainly learned a lot from those. We start kind of with the roles and that. So we have that, like we have one person with a job title, and that's me. I'm the CEO of the company, but that's more from an outside perspective. Yes. Investors want somebody to yell at if things aren't happening. And kind of, I feel that makes sense. Also, if you look at our people on LinkedIn, they have sort of outward facing roles for like titles for convenience. Internally, everybody's a game developer. So that's the role that we have. And it's kind of part of, it deals with another sort of personal, issue of mine, whereby when a company gets structured into these disciplines in a way, like it makes making decisions a lot harder. And it's harder to work as a team when you have to talk, let's talk to the tech department or the marketing department or whatever. I've also been in situations where there's overlapping, responsibilities and mandates and so on, and that can cause a lot of confusion. I do think that actually titles play into that rather than help with that, because if you have a traditional way to find a startup is like you get like people from 5 different companies who come with 5 preconceived notions of how hierarchy, like how titles and departments and things, roles and responsibilities work. So I feel that creates inherently a lot of confusion. When you kind of unmask that and allow people to go, well, I know about this and that thing, and now super importantly, we try to build an organization where you can also safely say, I don't know this thing and I don't know that thing. Like anybody coming into the organization, I always tell them that there's 2 things you should always be allowed to say in like when you're here. One of them is I don't know. Preferably followed with let's find out, if it's possible, that, but it should always be like, you should always be allowed to say, I don't know, with no pressure on you, because once you start masking that leads to really bad places and bad outcomes. Once you build this trust through this very active transparency, it's a lot hard. Like you'll still find situations where it's like, oh man, nobody's really making these decisions. But it's a lot easier for somebody to just raise their hand and say, nobody's making these decisions. Let's find out how to do it. Like in a traditional organization, there's a lot of
Yeah.
ego, a lot of sort of, well, I'm the producer, but I have no idea what they're talking about, but I'm being paid to know what they're talking about right now. So I should have an opinion. So then you get a lot of this really, you get a lot of sort of noise to your signal.
Yeah.
And I feel this way, and I think this is like for anybody looking to build a teal organization, I think the culture of everybody being very open about their strengths and limitations is key to building like the kind of structure that we have. And you really can't bypass that. Like I remember in the first year of when we were founded, I was diagnosed with ADHD, which is probably about half the listeners have already caught on to that. But bringing that up and being like 43 years of age at the time, like that was kind of, and just starting the company together, I was like, guys, do you still want to do this? Because I just found this out. I felt for me that was like a really big moment in moving forward. Okay, I can be myself. Because of course I was on a journey of finding out like why some things were so hard for me and why some things were so easy for me. And I think like it helped that all the founders, from day one started being very open about, well, these things are like, let's try to play to our strengths. Like these things we're good at. And then it's easier for a team to kind of organize themselves around, well, if you put all of these together, what's a thing we could tackle? I want to get to the question though you asked about salary. I think that's interesting because that we resolve that in the same way. We have what is called a salary advice group. They kind of dig information on things of, look at things, whatever inflation or whatever, how salaries are trending, whatever reports we can get our hands on and so on. And then when the time comes, people do themselves make suggestions that, hey, I should probably be getting this. Can I get like advice on this? Well, we do this annually. So the people say, hey, I'd like this change. And then people in the salary advice group comment on it. And then the person makes the decision. And of course, part of this is I contextualize that with the kind of financials of the company. This is kind of what we can afford right now. Like last time we should be keeping it within this level to be safe right now. And very transparent, like here are our financials. This is the money in bank. This is what, Mr. Autofire is generating for us. This is how many people are working on things that are not yet generating any revenue and so on. And that kind of allows then for people to, and then of course talk about the general things like inflation is high, so we need to factor that in and so on. And then people end up making good choices typically. Now, it's a thing like, and salaries are transparent. People have put their salaries up on our wiki that this is what I make, so others can go and look, and then it's transparent. When somebody comes into an organization like this, it takes a little while. And like, I've noticed like funny trends there. It can take, some people land on their feet very quickly, and some people take a longer time. It can take half a year for somebody to adjust to being like really part of the decision-making process. And I've talked to a lot of founders who are thinking like, should we start something, our company doing like with that kind of a mindset? And then they ask, what should we take into account? I think like one of the things like you really want to think about is also the seniority of the people. You don't want to do this if you haven't kind of seen a few organizations and their ups and downsides. It's that context is important for you. Like I think that allows for you to build the process as you need it, like as it becomes important for you to have it, and not front load that, but rather rely on your collective experience to avoid the most sort of the biggest, potential pitfalls, and not ruin the company by not having all the process in place. But I think there's that. And then the flip side of that is you do eventually want to have people who are less senior, but who see what you're doing as a great opportunity, for them, that they want to be part of it. If you have a very senior team, you can easily fall victim to old constraints that are not there any longer. I think that's a big trap that this is not necessarily a teal thing, but I think a teal organization is vulnerable to that too.
A lot to absorb, because I think like here, as you're talking really a whole company structure that is very elegant and common. Like a metaphor I see about what you've tried to achieve with your studio is basically helping people getting as close as possible to who they want to be in a working environment, because it's like you remove your title.
Yes.
For me, like it's very inspiring because it's transformative as well. Like we started the conversation as with co-founders, you all had to break your ego and deconstruct it. Like, who are you if you're not your title? And you doing kind of the same work for whoever is joining you is to redefine who they are and maybe being closer to who they are. Because creativity comes as well from, the self, or what you believe in, and like growing. For me, I always look for and value when places where having mature professionals. And this is a process that either you manage to mature through the process because it takes a lot of self-development, or it's not for you and it's too uncomfortable and you get ejected by the system. It's usually that's how it is. Am I correct, like reading this that way? Because
it's true. Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And I think people, like, we've had cases of people kind of finding out about themselves as they join, and then and I think the whole no titles thing also helps us in that, like, a very convenient way to structure yourself as an organization, like speaking as a former producer, is to have producers who look after the team and have a very sort of unicorny job description of knowing a little bit about everything, and reality, like realistically being competent in half the things you should be. Like, that's a very common role to have. So that's one of the things that we found. Like, we don't have a no producers rule. That wouldn't be us. But rather, we're like, let's be a little more specific about what the work is. And what's happened is that we, like for Mr. Autofire, like there's certain aspects of what a producer would do that is being done by the product manager, evolving into some of those things. There is again, there are no roles, but the person who previously used to be a product manager, and then the person doing a lot of QA work, actually stepping up to the plate and doing a lot of the producer functions of a team. And it allows for multiple people to approach and take a role that is typically like one of those roles where it's hard to be really good at all aspects of it. And I think that's where the trust comes into play as well, because you have to, that involves people going, I feel I'm on a journey to get there and I think I can do it. I'd love to give it a go. Are you supporting me, in that? And then giving it a go. And then there's been situations where people try to go somewhere, oh, this isn't working, but they can come back or evolve somewhere different. And I think that's really healthy. I think that's for us, because the teal organization has like a reason for existing. We haven't put it into words yet, and we kind of hesitate to put too much into words before we feel it's actually true and battlefield tested. But I do think that one of the things we're doing has to do with sustainability, and specifically sustainability in the sense of like, how do we make a place where a person can build a full-blown meaningful career in games and doesn't like have to, that isn't constantly buffeted by the organization's structural changes, but where people can actually evolve meaningfully. That's where we want to be. But of course, we're still a small company. Let's see if we get there. But I think that would be a worthy goal. That, like, I feel so much of what we do is still very project based as an industry, and has all the sort of negative underpinnings of like technology work and project-based entertainment stuff. I think there's a lot of potential in teal thinking there. And we just want to be we feel it's meaningful to be at the forefront of finding things out. There's so much to learn still, but
exactly, for the long journey. And I have a last question to close our conversation, and so many things to reflect. I'm so grateful for all the things you shared, and looking forward to future conversation. Maybe one reflection thought for you. Is there something like through all that experience that you feel regret of, or like a mistake, like a misbelief, like something you thought would be working and hasn't worked, and that you would like to share as well? As my last question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, I think I kind of assumed that we would be able to, like, that hiring would be very convenient as it used to be, like just get people in. I didn't realize how slowly and deliberately you have to grow the organization, and how much of like my effort and a lot of the founders' effort has to be not just, and I don't mean the act of hiring and signing papers. I mean the whole process of putting ourselves out there, advertising as an employer, and then going through interview processes, onboarding people, finding out if they're doing well, and so on, and sort of explaining the company to them. Like I assumed that's going to be a breeze going in, but that turned out to be like a really big thing. And a lot of the constraints that I didn't know exist for a company like this only became visible as we started doing this. One of the learnings is that it would be very difficult for us to operate with an outside publisher who has a lot of say in how we do things. Like we want to, that's why like we do the development and publishing everything in one team. Like a game team with us handles everything from the idea of the game to eventually building and live operating and sunsetting it. But like operating with other companies would be like fundamentally very difficult for us. And what really surprised me also was that like once I got excited about this, I thought everybody would get excited about it. You know what? Sometimes you have that fallacy, well, surely everybody's super happy. And then I love that we had some people very early on say, that sounds terrifying. I want no part in it. And I'm so happy that we found the straight shooters, because most people just back away slowly and don't say anything. But they're like, no, that sounds catastrophic. I just want to come in the morning, check my Jira tickets, solve issues, get back home, forget about it. That's all I want to do. I don't even want to talk to, I don't want to interface with the company at large. I realized that this is also like a specific dream for specific people, and that's okay. That's cool. But I thought it was like, no, surely there is a perfect organization. No, there's no single organization or organizational model is perfect. Like this is great for some people and terrifying for others. Like that. I think that was like, I just assumed that everybody would just kind of weirdly, I didn't tell myself this, but it was just an assumption that, well, people will mostly slot into this. And it takes a lot of time to find the people who are really into kind of, who see really like this as something meaningful for them, not just a thing they're willing to tolerate. So
yeah. And that's how you find your people. It's a slow process, but
it is.
Sustainability, when you are building a company, for the journey long term, that's what it takes.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thanks a lot, Kalle, for sharing like all the steps. And, I hope it's very inspiring for people. And if in some way they can reach out to you, Helsinki, especially in the community, to try some parts of it, 5 years in, we'll talk again and let's see where you are. Thanks a lot for inviting me over today and sharing, all those learnings.
So happy to have you here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this latest episode of the Rise and Play podcast. I am growing a community of conscious leaders across the industry and beyond. If you want to join this movement, please share the podcast with other conscious leaders, because we have so much more we can learn from each other. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate the show on Spotify or your other favorite podcast platform. It will help other growing leaders to discover the show and benefit from the valuable insights. If you would like to grow rapidly your leadership skills, you can find more insights on riseandplay.io, where you will also find my free masterclass on conscious leadership and other resources that I offer. Have a great week, and remember to take care of yourself. Until the next time,